Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on a big one. We're going to be doing a deep structural analysis of Japan's planned FY2026 budget.
And it's a record breaker, set at, I believe, 122.4 trillion.
That's the one. Now, I know what you're thinking. A national budget sounds, well, it sounds incredibly dry, right? Like a stack of reports.
It can be, but that's only if you read it like a ledger.
Right. And we're not going to do that. Because if you know how to read it, a budget is really the structural blueprint of where a nation is putting its energy, where it sees its future.
And just as importantly, where it anticipates the greatest pressures. The figure itself, the 122.4 trillion, that's just the headline, it's the political statement.
The soundbite.
Exactly. We call that the narrative layer, or N layer for short.
Mm-hmm.
And if you only look at that, you really miss the core engineering challenge the country's grappling with.
So our mission today is to get past that political noise.
To look past the raw numbers and focus on the actual mechanics, the operational system, or OS layer, and the underlying forces that are actually dictating these huge decisions.
So we're essentially trying to reverse engineer the country's nervous system. To do that, we're going to be using the MGF World Membrane Framework.
Mm-hmm.
For our listeners who might be new to this, why do we need this kind of specialized lens? What does a world membrane analysis show you that a standard financial report just completely misses?
It's all about structure over impression. That's the key.
Structure over impression.
Yes. A standard report tells you what the money is for. X trillion for defense, Y trillion for Social Security. It's a list.
A very expensive shopping list.
A very expensive one. Our framework looks at how these different areas of spending interact, almost like physical systems. We're interested in the objective functions. What is the government actually trying to maximize? And we're interested in the gradients, the pressure systems, the direction of travel. We want to identify those, inescapable forces that are constraining the politics of it all. We treat the national system like a dynamic, pressurized object.
I think we need a quick vocabulary check right up front then, because these concepts, membrane, velocity, shear, they're really the core language of this deep dive. Let's make sure we have some clear metaphors for them.
Good idea. Let's start with the membrane. Just think of it as a boundary, an interface where tension builds up.
Okay, a boundary.
We talk about three main membranes. First is the world membrane. That's the border where Japan meets the rest of the world, geopolitics, global markets, all of that.
Like external layer.
Exactly. Then you have the national membrane, which is the internal system, fiscal policy, government institutions, and finally, the living membrane.
And that's where it hits home for everyone.
That's where policy impacts daily life. Household budgets, the price of gas, wages, that's the living membrane.
That helps. So boundaries where pressure builds up. What about the next term, velocity? You've always stressed this isn't just about raw speed.
Correct. Velocity is the rate of change, the speed at which different parts of this whole system can move. For instance, the speed of demographic change and aging population is inherently slow, maybe a V of 0.1.
It's very slow.
But the speed of implementing new defense technology, that has to happen fast. That's a V of 1.0. When we talk about the operational system, the OS, we just mean the machinery, government, markets, tech that determines these different speeds.
And the problem comes when those speeds don't match up.
That's where you get shear.
The friction.
Shear is the critical indicator of systemic trouble. It's the friction, the heat that's created when these layers of the OS run at vastly different velocities, or when an external shock from the world membrane is absorbed unevenly by the national membrane. So today, we are basically hunting for these structural friction points inside that 122.4 trillion architecture.
Okay, with that framework in mind, let's start applying it. We're going to use the 17-axis MGF framework to walk through this, and we won't just list them off. We'll use them to build a picture of Japan's structural tensions, starting with the outside world.
Starting with how Japan is interacting with the global environment.
Right. So part A is world membrane contact, axes 1 through 3. Let's start with axis 1, global velocity alignment. The analysis points out right away that Japan is pouring money into areas that are accelerating globally.
Yes, very specifically. We're talking defense, AI, semiconductors, and what's now called economic security.
So why is it so critical for Japan to align with this specific global velocity right now? Is it just about staying competitive?
It goes deeper than that. I'd argue it's about strategic survival, not just economic growth. Global velocity alignment means choosing to plug into the highest speed systems in the world.
Which are largely dictated by the U.S.
Largely, yes. Take the 8.85 trillion in defense spending. That number keeps climbing. But it's not just about buying more ships or planes for Japan. It's a massive investment in interoperability.
So making sure their systems can talk to U.S. systems.
Perfectly. Japan is structurally wiring its defense and TechOS to be completely compatible with the U.S. military-industrial complex and its supply chain. They're making sure their system can run the same software, so to speak, as the fastest engine in the theater.
That makes the spending sound less like a choice and more like, well, a mandatory subscription fee to stay in the high-speed club.
That's an excellent way to put it. A cost of membership. And that membership has other costs, which brings us right to Axis 2, membrane pressure sensitivity.
If you're in the fast lane, you feel all the bumps.
And you absorb all the shocks that travel along it. The biggest shock hitting Japan's fiscal membrane right now is global interest rate hikes.
Historically, Japan was sort of insulated from that, right, with domestic rates near zero for so long.
That insulation layer has worn very, very thin. You have the U.S. Fed, the ECB, all the major central banks operating at a high rate hike velocity, a V of 1.0.
And that shockwave travels.
It transmits almost instantly into massive domestic pressure, simply because of the sheer size of Japan's national debt. The budget projects debt service costs at a staggering $32.4 trillion.
$32.4 trillion. Just for debt service.
Just to pay the interest and manage the debt. So when global rates rise, the cost of financing new debt or refinancing old debt as it matures, it just explodes.
Let's put that number in perspective.
Yeah.
$32.4 trillion is almost as much as they spend on the entire Social Security system.
It is.
It's over a quarter of the entire budget. And it's a deadweight cost dictated by forces completely outside of their control.
That is the perfect definition of membrane pressure sensitivity. It's the global financial V-layer shock directly hitting and eroding Japan's internal stability layer. We call it the S layer. It's a structural vulnerability that's been built up over decades, and now it's been activated by these external forces.
So in the face of all that pressure, what global identity is this budget trying to pay for? That's Axis 3, role assignment.
The budget is very clear about the roles it's funding. First, it's the anchor defense OS in East Asia within the U.S. Security Alliance. That requires predictable, sustained spending. No surprises.
Okay, the reliable partner.
Second, it's a key stabilizing force for regional economies. That often means funding development or infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific to maintain stability. And third, and this is crucial, it's reinforcing its identity as the world's most trusted, resilient node for technology and supply chains.
Especially for the really important stuff.
The critical stuff, semiconductors, specialized materials, high-end manufacturing components, they are literally funding reliability.
Okay, we've established the external pressures. Let's move inside now. How does this high-speed, high-pressure environment translate into the actual plumbing of the national OS?
Right. This is where we look at axes 4 through 6.
Let's start with axis 4, velocity boost, the acceleration gradient.
This measures the internal speed of the system, and the budget makes it crystal clear. Japan is in a determined acceleration phase.
This isn't just organic growth we're talking about.
No, not at all. This is directed, policy-driven acceleration. It's being achieved by deploying huge, targeted amounts of capital into defense, into building out AI infrastructure, into the domestic semiconductor ecosystem, and that big long-term project, the Green Transformation or GX agenda.
It sounds like a concerted effort to overcome that old image of Japanese policy inertia.
Desperately trying to. But every machine that's built for speed has to carry weight. And that brings us to axis 5, stability load. The heavy structure. What are the big, immovable objects weighing the system down?
Well, we've already mentioned one of them.
The debt service, $32.4 trillion. But the other anchor, the other massive weight, is welfare and Social Security. That's mandated at $34.8 trillion.
Wow. So together, those two fixed costs.
They consume nearly 55% of the entire record-breaking budget before anything else is decided. That is the structural gravity of the system.
And the problem is, one of those weights is getting heavier.
That's the critical point. The debt service component is not static. It's expanding at an accelerating pace because of those global interest rates. So the stable layer isn't just massive, it's actually experiencing an increasing downward velocity of its own.
So stability here is less about certainty and more about just this immense growing weight that they can't get rid of.
Exactly.
Which leads to axis 6, transparency trajectory.
Yeah.
How clear are the trade-offs that are being made to manage all this?
Well, procedural transparency is high. The T is good on paper. You can track every yen down to the last public works project if you have the patience.
Hmm.
But the analysis points to a deficit in what we call essential transparency,
Meaning.
meaning the budget narrative, the story they tell. It fails to clearly articulate the structural trade-offs. What future program, what lower priority social good is being sacrificed or delayed to afford this huge boost in defense and AI spending?
So the opportunity cost.
The strategic choice. The implicit cost of this acceleration is kind of obscured in the official presentation, and that prevents a true, informed public understanding of the structure.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. This is where we start to locate that systemic friction. Section C, shear and OS non-compatibility. Axes 7, 8, and 9.
This is all about the trouble caused by those speed differences we talked about.
Let's start with axis 7, fiscal shear, the core financial friction.
This is a direct consequence of that velocity inconsistency. As the debt service expands, and it's being fueled by fast-moving local interest rates, it creates an immediate mechanical consequence inside Japan.
Which is?
It rapidly reduces the government's future discretionary capacity.
So it's room to maneuver.
Exactly. This isn't just a budgeting headache, it's a structural handcuff on future policy. It limits your ability to respond to the next crisis.
Can you give us a tangible example of how that shear works?
Sure. Imagine the finance ministry identifies a critical need in, say, FY2028. Maybe it's a new national pandemic early warning system that needs $5 trillion.
Okay, hypothetical.
But between now and then, if global interest rates cause the debt service to expand by an unexpected $4 trillion, that future discretionary money for the warning system is just gone. It's been eaten up. The capacity is reduced to only a $1 trillion.
So the fast-moving external financial pressure is literally consuming the internal system's ability to plan for the future.
The consumption of future optionality is fiscal shear. It's the friction eating away at your choices.
And that reduction in choice, that loss of maneuverability, it must then translate down to the citizen, which is axis 8, societal shear. How is this friction felt on that living membrane?
Societal shear is the friction that's generated when different economic realities just collide. On one hand, you have rapid global inflation hitting the cost of everything, energy, imported food.
We all feel that.
On the other hand, you have high-speed government policy in defense and AI demanding huge resources. And caught in the middle, you have low-speed wage growth and the eventual inevitable need for future tax burdens to pay for all this.
The three-way collision.
Yes, and that collision creates tension right on the household budget, the living membrane. The analysis strongly suggests this tension will generate heat.
Heat in the form of what? Social unrest.
In the form of increased household instability, social anxiety, and, if it's left unmanaged, a political backlash.
And this friction is all rooted in those different speeds, which is axis 9, OS non-compatibility.
You use the analogy of a jet engine and a steam turbine.
Precisely. This is the structural contradiction at the very heart of this budget. Japan is trying to implement these high-speed, globally competitive policies, AI foundations, rapid deployment missile systems, things that require fluid capital and quick decisions.
The jet engine part.
But the whole system is fundamentally tethered to and trying to fund these extremely rigid, slow-moving systems, the existing Social Security funding mechanism, the inexorable, decades-long trend of demographic decline.
The steam turbine.
The speed differential is just too vast. The budget is trying to force these two things to connect, but their basic incompatibility guarantees high, continuous friction. So if the shear points show us where the trouble is brewing, the gradients show us where the whole system is being forcefully pushed. Let's move to section D, gradients, axis 10 to 12.
Right. First is axis 10, the acceleration gradient. What direction is the entire structural mass being moved?
And the answer is?
Unambiguous and highly accelerated. It's security, technology, and economic security. We call it the triple vector.
Triple vector.
The budget is pushing enormous capital and political will towards that global alignment, towards solidifying Japan's position as a techno-security power. This gradient is just overwhelming most of the internal resistance.
But there's a huge risk built into this acceleration, which is axis 11, the risk gradient, or the fixed risk.
The single largest fixed risk is that interest rate structure we keep coming back to. And this isn't a temporary problem. It's a locked-in, continuous vulnerability.
How so?
If the fixed risk is the sheer volume of the debt itself, the risk gradient is the amplifying mechanism. A small external tick upwards in global rates automatically translates into a large internal explosion of debt service costs.
So it locks in a high-intensity risk that just keeps squeezing that future fiscal freedom we talked about.
The system is structurally fragile. It's brittle when it comes to external rate volatility.
So what's the government's strategy for managing the risk to its citizens? Axis 12. Living gradient. Defending the membrane.
They're using strategic but temporary buffers. You see it in the subsidies for electricity and gas. You see it in the targeted tax relief, the increases in child support.
So short-term pain relief.
It's designed to absorb that immediate pressure on the living membrane, to provide some political breathing room by treating the symptoms of inflation.
But the analysis warns this might not be enough.
It warns that the underlying structural forces, the fixed interest costs, the persistent global inflation, are operating at a higher velocity than these temporary measures. The buffers will likely be overwhelmed over time. It's like putting a temporary sealant on a major structural leak.
Policy acceleration on this scale obviously requires a lot of political will. Let's talk about political capital, axes 13 and 14. How is the government using its political currency here?
Axis 13, political capital utilization, is key. The source material suggests a very strategic use of high political support.
Meaning they're spending it while they have it.
When approval ratings are high, and they're estimated around 70–75% for the current administration, the political cost of implementing these huge, potentially unpopular changes is much lower.
Like the massive defense hikes.
Exactly. Or the big new investment mandates. They are using this period of high capital to push through the acceleration phase as quickly as possible because they know that window of opportunity might not stay open forever.
But that capital is a finite resource, which is axis 14. Support sustainability. What determines if they can keep this momentum going?
The long-term sustainability of that political capital is tied 100% to successfully managing the living membrane.
It all comes back to the household budget.
It all comes back to whether this huge push for growth and technology translates into sustained real wage improvement that actually outpaces inflation. If the living membrane collapses, if that societal shear becomes too severe,
then the public support evaporates.
and those large acceleration expenditures, especially on defense, could trigger a sharp negative political gradient. Acceleration would suddenly be framed as, spending money on foreign priorities while citizens suffer at home.
Okay, let's bring all three of these layers together now. World, national, and living.
Yeah.
The final section of the framework. Membrane synthesis. Axis 15 to 17.
Starting with axis 15, membrane coherence. Are these layers working together, or are they tearing each other apart?
And the verdict is
Partially coherent, partially sharing.
not the split decision.
There's very strong coherence between the world membrane and the national OS. Japan has clearly aligned its top-level strategy with global tech and security standards. That part is in sync. But there is severe and intensifying shear between the rigid national OS, with its high fixed costs, and the fragile living membrane, which is all about household stability. The alignment is happening at the top, but the friction is getting worse at the bottom.
That shrinking room for error brings us right to axis 16, exit options. How much freedom does the government actually have left? We talked about fiscal shear eating up future capacity.
Fiscal latitude, that breathing room you need for discretionary spending or to respond to the next unexpected crisis, is shrinking very, very rapidly.
So the walls are closing in.
The escalating stability load, driven by that accelerating debt service, means the system is entering a highly constrained corridor. Depending on what global interest rates do, the options for any major new discretionary spending in the coming years could be drastically reduced. They're running out of ways to spend their way out of the next problem.
So given all this complexity, all these constraints, what is the one core strength Japan absolutely must protect through all this? Axis 17, structural advantage.
Japan's core structural advantages are twofold, and they are irreplaceable. First, the unmatched reliability of its technology and its supply chains.
The Made in Japan brand is still powerful.
Extremely. And second, its internal social stability. The current high-stakes strategy is basically a bet that Japan can successfully plug into the global fast lane of AI and defense without compromising those two core strengths.
Because if the societal shear gets too bad and destroys that internal stability,
then the global advantage of being seen as reliable is lost, and that's a catastrophic failure.
we've used the 17 axis to map out all the forces. Now, let's try to simplify the central conflict here, this idea of velocity and consistency. Why is the difference in speed structurally the most important thing for you to understand about this budget?
Because fundamentally, it explains why the whole system feels unstable, even when they're spending these massive amounts of money on growth and security. We're looking at a national OS that is intrinsically speed inconsistent.
It's trying to be two things at once.
Three things at once, actually. This budget is an attempt to define a new operational architecture, but it has to house three systems running at three fundamentally different speeds, all at the same time.
Okay, let's detail those three speeds then, the different parts of the national OS.
Let's start with the fastest. Number one is the high-speed OS. You can think of this as the jet engine component. Its velocity is about 1.0.
And what's in that category?
These are the parts that have to move at global speed because they're dictated by geopolitical urgency. We're talking defense capabilities, AI research, the semiconductor supply chain, and the green transformation technology mandates.
Things that can't wait.
They demand rapid capital, nonstop upgrades, and fast-track decisions just to stay in the game. These are the parts built for sprinting.
Okay, that's the high-speed OS. What's next?
Next is the mid-speed OS. Its velocity is, let's say, around 0.5. These are the regulatory and administrative systems.
The bureaucracy.
Fiscal policy, the general tax system, the bureaucracy, general administration, they react much more slowly. They operate on an annual legislative cycle constrained by political processes. They can steer and change direction, but there's a significant lag time compared to the high-speed OS.
So they're the framework trying to manage the sprinter.
A very slow-moving framework. And finally, you have the anchor, the immense, immovable weight that's tethering the whole system down.
The low-speed OS.
The low-speed OS. Its velocity is approaching 0, maybe 0.1. This is defined by things like social security structures, the long-term population and demographic trends, and these deeply embedded institutional arrangements.
That's real slow.
Because they're dictated by decades-long trends and core societal contracts. You can't just change them overnight. They are functionally immutable in the short term, so they act as this massive inertial anchor on everything else.
So what this FY2026 budget is doing structurally is increasing the horsepower of the high-speed OS, more money for AI, more for defense. But it's still being forced to haul the staggering weight of the low-speed OS.
Yes.
The Social Security and that accelerating debt service.
It is the ultimate structural engineering problem. You're spending a fortune to accelerate the top layer, while the foundation, the low-speed OS, acts as a giant structural anchor. The system is designed to sprint, but its base can't move fast enough to keep up.
So let's explain the mechanism of shear one more time.
Yeah.
The friction isn't just a side effect. It's the inevitable result of this design.
The difference in speed is the friction. That's the main takeaway. When the high-speed OS tries to accelerate, say, they announce a new hot $10 trillion investment package for foundational tech.
Okay.
That capital has to be drawn from or allocated alongside the resources that are being demanded by the low-speed OS. The two are structurally linked through the central budget.
There's only one pot of money.
And this relative movement between a system trying to sprint and a system that can only crawl generates intense systemic heat and friction. That is the shear.
If you visualize it, it's like the whole nation is on a giant treadmill. The top section, AI and defense, is set to an all-out sprint. But the foundation, Social Security and debt, is set to a slow walk.
And the connection points, the fiscal interfaces between them, are just being torn apart.
And that tearing is the real damage.
That tearing is the erosion of capacity. The damage caused by the shear is the reduction of future discretionary spending, that's fiscal shear, and the compromise of household stability. That's societal shear. It is a direct structural consequence of demanding incompatible velocities within a single integrated national system.
We've identified the structure and the friction points. So now let's use the idea of gradients to talk about the future. Where is all this pressure pushing Japan over the next, say, 3 to 10 years? It seems like this powerful dual structure, acceleration pulling one way and structural gravity pulling the other.
That's right. Let's look at the acceleration vectors first. These are the specific areas where the system is pushing for that rapid alignment with global forces.
This is more than just throwing money at problems.
Oh, it's deeply strategic. In defense, acceleration means moving rapidly into advanced capabilities, long-range missile systems, developing unmanned assets, hardening critical infrastructure against cyber and physical attacks.
And for the economy.
It's the high-speed establishment of domestic semiconductor production. That means massive subsidies, regulatory streamlining, getting those fabs built yesterday, For energy, it's the green transformation, or GX, a massive push for net zero which requires incredibly rapid technological substitution.
So these things are all moving on a geopolitical clock, not a slow domestic planning cycle.
They have to. They are acting with intense urgency in these areas.
Okay, but then you have the opposing force, the deceleration vectors, the gravity. What are the big immovable weights?
These are the persistent drags, the sources of that low-speed OS inertia that are simply unavoidable.
And number one on the list is?
The non-negotiable fixed debt service, which we've established is actually accelerating in its own way due to external rates. Then, the ever-increasing Social Security costs dictated by a rapidly aging population.
Things you can't just wish away.
And finally, institutional rigidities. The accumulated complexity of bureaucracy and regulation that just naturally resists high-speed change. These vectors constantly apply this powerful downward gravitational pull, and that prevents any kind of sustained, comfortable acceleration.
So the structural phase that this budget really captures is defined by this conflict. The national OS is in a dual structure. It's accelerating sharply in these very specific, high-priority areas,
while simultaneously being decelerated by these enormous structural and unavoidable loads.
That sounds like the defining tension of Japan's entire economic policy for the next decade.
I believe it is. The country's trying to outrun its internal problems while simultaneously investing heavily in the global future.
And when forces oppose each other like that, friction heat accumulates. We need to locate where that heat is most likely to cause a structural failure.
Let's start with the most obvious: fiscal stability shear. The rising interest rate cost isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It's the mechanical erosion of the system's stability layer.
The S layer.
The faster rates rise, the quicker that stability layer thins out. And the less money is available for things that maintain future stability like R&D, education, or just basic infrastructure maintenance.
And then there's the pain point for you, the listener. Household burden shear.
This is the visible manifestation of that societal shear we talked about. Inflation, price increases, especially for energy and imported goods. These are immediate, painful pressures right on the living membrane.
And wages aren't keeping up.
Since wage increases are lagging or they're very unevenly distributed, the real disposable income for many, many households is shrinking. That creates high friction at the citizen-state interface. It generates distrust, anxiety,
which leads to a political consequence.
Political shear.
Right. To sustain this high-velocity agenda, especially the expensive defense buildup and the semiconductor subsidies, the government needs sustained political consensus.
Which is fragile. If the living membrane fails, if the cost of living crisis becomes too severe, that consensus just evaporates. Political capital dries up. And the very policy that was designed for acceleration becomes politically toxic, and that forces a deceleration.
There's also friction on the inputs themselves, right? Resource shear.
That's a great point. You can allocate $5 trillion to build a new AI data center, but you cannot instantly generate the specialized human capital you need to run it.
The people.
The people. These big technology investments generate immediate friction through problems like labor shortages, fierce competition for skilled engineers, bottlenecks in supply chains for specialized materials. The capital moves fast, but the human resources move slow. That's resource shear.
So if we look 3 to 10 years down the road, what is the inevitable intermediate outcome of all these conflicting forces? Where does this road lead?
Well, the commitment to the high-velocity global security layer defense and tech is now, I would say, irrevocable. Japan is all in.
So there's no turning back on that.
But the rising fiscal rigidity caused by the shear, by the debt service eating up capacity, makes a major structural renegotiation unavoidable in the medium term. The nation will eventually face an existential choice.
The choice between what?
Likely around the end of this decade, a choice between 3 painful, politically difficult options. 1, aggressive, broad-based tax hikes to fund the fixed costs. 2, significant major expenditure reform, which really means cutting Social Security entitlements. Or 3, finding some radical, non-conventional way to achieve massive debt compression.
And right now, they're just using up the road before they get to that fork.
They are.
The structural analysis is very clear. Acceleration versus gravity is generating this intense shear. So let's make this tangible now. Let's focus on how these different layers, world, national, and living, crash into each other, and how this deep structural tension really affects you, the individual Japanese citizen.
Right. We need to identify the specific external forces that are applying the most acute pressure on the Japanese system, the ones forcing the structural change through the budget.
Let's start with the geopolitical drivers. What's coming from the outside?
The U.S. AI military acceleration is the primary strategic vector. It mandates massive, time-sensitive defense and tech investment just to maintain that interoperability and strategic parity in East Asia.
So that spending isn't optional. It's a required upgrade to stay in the alliance.
It's a required upgrade. At the same time, you have China's economic slowdown and its internal instability. That requires Japan to reinforce its regional stability role, which often means an increased fiscal commitment to regional aid and development just to prevent things from cascading.
And what's the financial pressure mechanism? How does the world squeeze the budget?
It's those global interest rates. Crucially, they are totally external to Japan's domestic economy, yet they penetrate the Japanese budget structure immediately and efficiently.
They're a direct hit.
This high external financial velocity directly inflates that massive debt service. It acts like an external gravitational pull that restricts all internal fiscal movement. It's like the world demanding higher rent on Japan's biggest structural weakness.
So that's the world hitting the nation. Now, how does that internal friction, the fiscal shear, the stability load transfer pressure directly to the household?
This is the critical collision point. This is where abstract budgets become lived reality. The core issue is the cost competition.
One part of the budget fighting another.
Increased mandatory debt service directly competes with discretionary social spending. Every single yen that's allocated to higher interest payments is a yen that cannot be allocated to expanding childcare or improving local roads or raising pension benefits. The fiscal shear becomes visible competition for resources.
And then there's the immediate pressure everyone feels at the supermarket.
That's the fundamental mismatch, inflation versus wages. High global prices, driven by energy costs and supply chain issues, are beating the delayed and uneven domestic wage increases.
So even if you get a raise, you feel poorer.
This gap between rising costs and lagging incomes causes immediate and continuous living membrane distress. This is why that societal shear is intensifying. People feel poorer because they are poorer in real terms.
But what about the temporary measures in the budget? The subsidies for gas and electricity. They were designed to protect people, weren't they?
They were, and they provide necessary immediate political and economic insulation for the living membrane. They prevent an immediate collapse.
But they're a patch.
They're fundamentally temporary patches. They alleviate the immediate pain, but they prolong the underlying fiscal sustainability problems by adding to the deficit, which eventually just circles back and adds to the fixed cost burden. It's short-term relief that contributes to long-term rigidity.
So what's the midterm outlook for household pressure? It sounds grim.
In the midterm, the confluence of accelerating interest costs, persistent global inflation, and the eventual necessity for higher taxes or contributions to deal with the deficit. It will all continue to exert significant accelerating pressure on households.
The squeeze comes from three directions.
Higher costs, shrinking public services, and looming tax hikes. The living membrane will remain the system's primary tension point.
And this final intersection closes the feedback loop, right? The living membrane connects back to the political OS.
It closes the loop. The stability of your policy velocity is directly tied to the happiness of your citizens.
So the stability of the living membrane is the #1 determinant of a government's approval ratings.
Exactly. The stability of household economics, that perception of fairness and future prospects, is the primary determinant of political capital. High capital allows that high-speed OS to accelerate. If a leader has 75% approval, they can push through an $8.85 trillion defense budget, and the public will, grudgingly accept it.
But if that household friction increases,
If that household friction, the societal shear, intensifies, prices are too high, jobs feel insecure, approval ratings plummet, and that instantly reduces the available political capital.
and it slows everything down.
It drastically slows the policy velocity of the high-speed OS. A government facing public anger can't deploy massive capital for long-term strategic goals. They're forced to shift resources immediately to short-term pain relief measures. The living membrane effectively acts as the speed governor for the entire national OS.
So if we look across all 17 axes, across all three layers, where did the MGF analysis identify the single biggest mismatch? The primary shear point that's going to define the next decade for Japan.
The main shear point is the fundamental non-compatibility between the highly accelerated geopolitical and technological policy layer and the rigid, slow-moving demographic and social security structure.
the jet engine tied to the massive anchor.
That inherent structural difference is then drastically exacerbated by the external weight of global interest rate pressure. The high-speed OS is pushing forward on global demands while being violently dragged down by the low-speed OS, and global finance is continuously adding extra weight to the anchor chain. That single point of friction is the most dangerous spot in the entire FY2026 blueprint.
So to wrap this all up, if you had to synthesize the core conclusion of this MGF analysis, what would it be?
I would say the FY2026 budget represents Japan's decisive commitment to the high-velocity global sphere defense, AI, economic security, while being simultaneously anchored by its massive, slow-moving domestic fiscal gravity. The two forces are now accelerating in opposition to each other, creating a state of maximum structural tension.
So the budget isn't a plan so much as it is a structural map of a conflict. It's a record of the forces that are currently tearing at the national OS as it tries to reconcile these global demands with its domestic constraints.
Precisely. The required concluding line that I think really captures the essence of this whole analysis is this: Japan's national OS now stands in a dual structure of acceleration and structural shear.
A dual structure of acceleration and structural shear. The question then, for you, the learner, isn't just if Japan can afford this acceleration phase. It's how long can that acceleration be maintained before the compounding fiscal and societal shear forces compel some kind of structural correction? Does the urgency from the outside, from the world membrane, the geopolitical demands of AI and defense, outweigh the powerful, persistent domestic gravity of debt and demographics? That tension is the defining economic and political challenge Japan has to navigate over the next decade.
And that ongoing conflict is what we'll continue to track very closely in the next World Membrane log.
Until then, stay curious.